For 20 years, China played one game better than anyone else on Earth. It didn't chase the flashy part of the battery. It didn't fight over lithium mines or the headline-grabbing cathode chemistry that news anchors love to talk about. It quietly took control of a soft, gray mineral that most people have never thought about for a single second in their lives. Graphite, the stuff sitting inside every phone, every laptop, and every electric car battery on the planet. By the time the rest of the world looked up, China already controlled almost the entire supply. And then, standing at the very top of that mountain, Chinese companies did something that sounds completely insane. They started building the exact technology designed to make graphite obsolete. This is the story of how China cornered the world's graphite, turned it into a weapon, and then quietly began killing it themselves. Before we go any further, if you like breakdowns of how China is reshaping the technology behind everyday life, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel covers the moves most of the world ignores until it is far too late. Now, let's get into it. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what an anode actually does, because almost nobody outside the industry does. A battery has two main sides. When you charge your phone, lithium ions rush over to one side and get stored there. When you use your phone, they flow back out to power it. The side that holds those ions while charging is called the anode. And here is the simple truth that runs this entire trillion-dollar industry. Whatever material you use for that anode decides how much energy your battery can hold and how fast it can charge. For more than 30 years, the answer to that question has been the same boring word: graphite. Graphite won because it was stable, cheap, and it just worked. It didn't swell up dangerously. It didn't burst into flames if you looked at it wrong. It held lithium neatly and let it go neatly, thousands of times, without falling apart. When Sony commercialized the first modern lithium-ion battery back in 1991, a carbon anode was at the heart of it, and the industry never really looked back. Over the next 3 decades, the whole world standardized around graphite. Your smartphone, your laptop, your electric car, your power tools, even the giant storage systems that keep power grids alive at night, nearly all of them run on a graphite anode. Every single electric vehicle battery pack needs somewhere between 50 and 100 kilograms of the stuff. Multiply that across millions of cars a year, and you start to see the scale of what we are talking about. And that scale is exploding. The International Energy Agency has estimated that battery demand could push graphite consumption to somewhere between 6 and 30 times current levels by 2040. Think about that range. Even the low end means the world will need 6 times more of this material than it uses today. Whoever controls that supply doesn't just control batteries. They hold a hand on the throat of the entire clean energy transition, the electric car industry, and a huge slice of modern electronics. This was the prize, and one country understood its value long before anyone else was paying attention. Here is where the story turns. Graphite the mineral is not the same thing as graphite the battery material. You cannot dig gray rock out of the ground and drop it into a battery. It has to be purified, shaped into tiny, perfect spheres, coated, and treated at extreme temperatures in a process called graphitization. That middle step, turning raw material into battery-grade anode powder, is brutally hard, energy-hungry, and honestly, kind of dirty. It burns enormous amounts of electricity, and it is not the sort of industry a wealthy Western country is eager to host in its own backyard. And that is precisely the step China decided to own. While Western companies chased software and services and easy profits, China spent 2 decades doing the unglamorous work, building furnaces, building processing plants, absorbing the pollution and the power bills that nobody else wanted, crushing costs year after year until nobody outside the country could compete on price. The numbers today are almost hard to believe. China accounts for roughly 78% of the world's mined graphite. It produces around 90% of all battery anode material. And when it comes to graphitization, the specific high-temperature step that makes synthetic graphite usable, China controls something close to 98% of global capacity. 98%. That is not a lead. That is a chokehold. Think about what that actually means. A battery factory in Germany, or a car plant in Michigan, or an electronics maker in South Korea can design the most advanced cell in the world. But when it comes time to buy the anode, the answer almost always traces back to China. There was no real alternative, and the pricing made escape almost impossible. In 2025, graphite prices actually fell by around 11%, even as battery demand kept climbing. A strange disconnect driven almost entirely by China's overwhelming control of supply. Cheap Chinese material kept flooding the market, and Western producers trying to build their own graphite businesses found themselves under what analysts openly called an existential threat. You cannot build a new factory to compete with a rival who can sell below your costs whenever they choose. For years, this was just quietly accepted as the way things worked, but dependence like that never stays quiet forever. In December of 2023, the world got its first real warning. China's Ministry of Commerce announced export controls on graphite. On paper, the immediate damage was limited. Shipments kept moving, but the message landed like a thunderclap in boardrooms and government offices around the world. Beijing had just reminded everyone that it could turn the tap, the single most important battery material on Earth, and one country decided who got to buy it and who did not. Suddenly, graphite stopped being a boring industrial input and became something else entirely. A pressure point, a lever, a weapon. And China was only getting started. In October of 2025, the Ministry of Commerce went much further. It issued a sweeping new decision that placed lithium batteries, certain cathode materials, and artificial graphite anode materials onto its list of controlled dual-use items, effective from early November. This was not a warning shot anymore. Now, exporting advanced anode material, or the equipment used to make it, required a license from the Chinese government. They even named the specific machines: the granulation reactors, the graphitization furnaces, the coating and modification equipment, the exact tools a rival country would need to build its own anode industry from scratch. China was not just guarding its material, it was guarding the recipe, the kitchen, and the ovens all at once. The United States had already seen this coming and tried to fight back with money. American graphite producers filed trade complaints, and Washington responded with punishing tariffs, preliminary countervailing duties near 67%, then preliminary anti-dumping duties around 94% stacked on top in the middle of 2025. Add in the tariffs that already existed, and the total cost of importing Chinese anode material briefly shot toward 200%. The idea was simple: make Chinese graphite so expensive that American factories would have no choice but to build a domestic supply chain and finally break the dependence. China's response was almost casual, and honestly, a little bit brilliant. Instead of shipping anode material directly from China and eating the tariffs, major producers like BTR simply rerouted through Indonesia. Raw feedstock and precursor material flowed into Indonesian facilities, got processed there, and came out the other side, largely sidestepping the American duties. Indonesian anode imports had been essentially zero the year before. Almost overnight, the country was moving meaningful volumes. The wall the United States tried to build had a door quietly cut into it before the concrete even dried. This is the pattern that keeps repeating. The West builds a barrier, and China finds a way around it before it matters. Then came the twist that shows just how much control Beijing really has. In November of 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce suddenly announced it was temporarily easing those graphite export restrictions to the United States, valid through late 2026. For a moment, it looked like a peace offering, but read it the other way, and the message is chilling. China can tighten the grip, and China can loosen the grip, entirely on its own schedule. The West was not negotiating from a position of strength, it was waiting to see what Beijing would decide next. When you can turn a global supply chain on and off like a light switch, You don't need to make threats. Everyone in the room already understands who is holding the switch. There is a harder edge to all of this that goes beyond electric cars and phones. Graphite is not just a commercial material. It shows up in defense systems, and analysts have ranked it as one of the highest supply risk minerals on the entire critical materials list, precisely because so much of it flows through a single country. That is why the United States Defense Logistics Agency began moving toward stockpiling flake graphite, putting in a request to buy tens of thousands of tons over several years. When a government starts hoarding a material the way it hoards fuel and metals for a possible war, that tells you how seriously the strategic risk is now being taken. A humble battery ingredient had quietly become a national security issue, so by the middle of the 2020s, the picture looked settled. China had won graphite so completely that experts openly said any real shift in that control was at least 5 years away, maybe longer. In the near term, one analyst put it plainly, China's role in the anode supply chain was simply irreplaceable. Game over. Except graphite itself had a problem that no amount of dominance could fix. And this is where the entire story flips upside down. Graphite has a hard ceiling, a physical limit baked into the material by nature itself. Its theoretical capacity to store energy maxes out at 372 units of charge per gram, and modern graphite anodes are already bumping right up against that wall. There is almost nothing left to squeeze out, which is a serious problem because the world keeps demanding more. Longer-range electric cars, phones that last 2 days on a charge, fast charging that fills a battery in minutes instead of hours. Graphite simply cannot deliver much more than it already does. It carried the industry as far as it possibly could, and then it ran out of road. For decades, scientists have known exactly what the answer should be: silicon. The same element found in sand and computer chips. On paper, silicon is a miracle. It can hold more than 10 times as much lithium as graphite. Its theoretical capacity is around 4,200 units per gram compared to graphite's measly 372. Swap graphite for silicon, and you could shrink a battery, lighten it, extend the range, and charge it faster, all at once. It sounds too good to be true, and for the longest time, it absolutely was. Silicon had a vicious flaw that broke every battery it touched. When silicon absorbs lithium during charging, it swells. Not a little. It expands by 300 to 400%, ballooning to several times its original size. Then when the battery discharges, it shrinks back down. Charge, swell, discharge, shrink, over and over, hundreds of times. Any material would crack under that kind of abuse, and silicon did exactly that. The anode would fracture, crumble, and lose its ability to hold a charge. A battery that dies after a few dozen cycles is worthless. So silicon sat on the shelf for years, the brilliant material that nobody could tame. Every lab knew the prize was there. Nobody could figure out how to grab it without getting burned. The breakthrough came from a genuinely clever idea. If pure silicon swells too much, don't use pure silicon. Instead, take tiny silicon particles and lock them inside a microscopic carbon cage. A porous scaffold with empty space built right into it. Now, when the silicon expands during charging, it swells into those empty pockets instead of shattering the whole structure. From the outside, the anode stays roughly the same size and holds together cycle after cycle. This is the silicon-carbon composite, and it is the technology that finally cracked the code. Western startups like Sila Nanotechnologies and Group 14 pioneered a lot of this architecture. And for a while, it looked like the West might own the next generation of anodes, the way China owned the last one. But watch what actually happened when the technology became real. The first place silicon-carbon batteries showed up in ordinary life was not an American gadget. It was Chinese smartphones. Brands like Honor, Xiaomi, Vivo, and Oppo started shipping flagship phones packed with silicon-carbon batteries across 2025 and 2026. The Honor Magic 7 Pro was one of the standouts. Suddenly, phones that were thinner also lasted longer, because the anode inside could hold more energy in less space. Even fitness trackers like the Whoop band quietly switched over. The future arrived without any fanfare, in the pockets and on the wrists of millions of people, and most of them had no idea the material inside had just changed after 30 years of standing still. Then the giant moved. In April of 2026, at a major event in Beijing, CATL, the largest battery maker in the world, pulled back the curtain. Among a whole lineup of new batteries, they unveiled a condensed cell built on a high nickel cathode, paired with a low-expansion silicon-carbon anode. That silicon-carbon anode alone contributed a jump of around 50 units of energy density, helping push the cell toward 350 units per kilogram, a number that graphite could only dream about. CATL spoke openly about battery technology, enabling ranges pushing toward 1,500 kilometers on a single charge, with mass production planned for later in the year. The company that got rich selling the old world was now openly building the new one, and CATL did not stop at silicon. At the same event, it revealed how far it had pushed sodium-ion batteries, a completely different chemistry that ditches lithium and graphite altogether. Sodium batteries use a material called hard carbon for the anode, not graphite at all. For years, the industry struggled to mass produce them because of stubborn engineering problems. CATL said it had cracked 4 of the biggest ones, including moisture control and a self-forming anode system, clearing the path for large-scale production by the end of 2026. The chairman of CATL suggested sodium could eventually replace 30 to 40% of the existing battery market. These cells stay stable in brutal cold, reportedly holding around 90% of their capacity even at 40 degrees below zero, and they are expected to cost meaningfully less than today's cheapest lithium batteries. The company even landed a single sodium battery order, reported at 60 gigawatt hours, the largest of its kind. And this was not just a lab demonstration. Chinese automakers moved fast to put sodium cells into real vehicles. CATL and Chang'an showed off a passenger car running on a sodium-ion battery in early 2026, with plans stretching across battery swapping stations, commercial trucks, and grid storage. A battery you can build without lithium and without graphite that shrugs off freezing cold and costs less to make. For huge parts of the market, especially cheap city cars and energy storage, that is a direct hit on the old graphite-based formula. So while the West was still scrambling to catch up on graphite, China quietly opened a second front that skips graphite completely. China was not betting on a single horse. It was buying the whole racetrack. Now, look back at the anode itself, and here is the part that reveals the real strategy. The single largest anode maker on the planet is a Chinese company called BTR. In one recent year, BTR shipped somewhere around 595,000 tons of anode material, more than anyone else on Earth. That business was built on graphite. But BTR is now also shipping thousands of tons of silicon-carbon anode material to major cell makers, reportedly including customers tied to CATL, Panasonic, and Tesla. Read that again. The king of graphite is also becoming a leader in the very thing that competes with graphite. China did not get caught off guard by the silicon revolution. China is helping to run it. You can even see the shift inside the financial results. BTR watched the price of ordinary artificial graphite sag under all that oversupply, squeezing its margins on the old product. What cushioned the blow was the premium it could charge for its newer silicon anode material. In other words, plain graphite is sliding into a low-margin commodity grind, while the silicon future is where the real money is starting to move. The companies that saw that early, and almost all of them are Chinese, are quietly repositioning to win the next decade instead of clinging to the last one. This is the move that most people completely miss. The West looked at China's graphite dominance and assumed the only way to break free was to leapfrog it, to skip graphite entirely and win the silicon future instead. It was a reasonable plan. There was just one problem. China had the same idea years earlier, and it had something the West did not: the factories, the engineers, the supply chains, the 2 decades of hard-won manufacturing muscle. Silicon-carbon anodes still need advanced carbon scaffolding, precise coating, and enormous processing know-how. All of that overlaps heavily with the exact skills China perfected while conquering graphite. The head start in the old technology quietly became a head start in the new one. Now, this is the point where the honest part of the story matters, because the truth is more interesting than the hype. Graphite is not actually dead. Not yet, and not for a long time. Silicon-carbon anodes today are still expensive, costing roughly 15 to 20 units per kilowatt-hour to produce compared to about 5 for graphite. Most current designs don't even use pure silicon. They blend a small amount of silicon into a mostly graphite anode to get a boost without paying the full cost. Analysts expect silicon-based anodes to climb from a tiny sliver of the market a few years ago to perhaps 20% by the middle of the 2030s. That is a revolution, but it is a gradual one. Graphite will still be sitting inside most batteries for years to come. The headline that says graphite is already dead is early. The reality is that graphite just stopped being the whole story, and that reframes everything. The question was never really whether silicon would replace graphite overnight. The question was, who would control the transition? Who would own both the old world and the new one at the same time, collecting profit on the way up and on the way down? And right now, uncomfortably for a lot of Western governments, the answer to both questions keeps coming back to the same place. China sells the graphite the world runs on today. China is building the silicon anodes the world will run on tomorrow. And China holds the export licenses that decide how fast anyone else gets to catch up. And copying China's playbook is far harder than it sounds. The graphitization step that makes synthetic anode material is enormously power-hungry and generates real pollution. Building that capacity in the United States or Europe means fighting through environmental permits, high electricity costs, and years of construction, all while a Chinese rival stands ready to drop prices the moment your factory finally opens. It is the classic trap. The very reasons the West let this industry drift to China in the first place are the same reasons it is so painful to claw back now. You cannot just wish a furnace into existence. You have to build it, power it, and survive the price war that follows. The West is not standing still, to be fair. Companies like Group 14, Sila, Psionic Energy, and others are racing to scale silicon anode production outside of China. Governments are pouring money into domestic graphite mines and processing plants. There is real innovation happening, real capital, and real urgency behind it. But scaling a materials industry is not a software update. It takes furnaces, years, and billions of dollars to build what China already has running at full speed today. Cost parity for silicon anodes might arrive around 2027 or 2028, and even then, the manufacturing muscle still lives mostly in one country. Demand is only going to make the pressure worse. Analysts at Wood Mackenzie projected electric vehicle demand growing by nearly a fifth in a single year, adding hundreds of gigawatt hours of new consumption. Every one of those batteries needs an anode, and most of those anodes still trace back to the same place. None of this is happening in a vacuum. Silicon-carbon batteries have quietly become one of the newest fronts in the technology rivalry between the United States and China, sitting right alongside advanced chips, artificial intelligence, and rare earth magnets. The reason is simple: whoever controls the best anode controls the best battery, and whoever controls the best battery controls electric cars, drones, grid storage, and a fast-growing list of military hardware. This is no longer a niche materials science debate buried in academic journals. It has become a question of raw industrial power, and the countries that once treated batteries as a boring commodity are waking up to find they handed a rival a commanding lead in one of the defining technologies of the age. And there is another horizon beyond even silicon. The ultimate anode, the one that pushes energy density to the absolute limit, is pure lithium metal, the centerpiece of the solid-state batteries that every major player is now chasing. Here, too, China is not sitting on the sidelines. Chinese firms have been racking up recognition for solid-state and semi-solid-state progress, and CATL has openly mapped a research path reaching toward exotic future chemistries. The lesson keeps repeating. Whatever anode comes next, whether it is silicon today, sodium's hard carbon alongside it, or lithium metal further out, the same names, the same factories, and the same country keep appearing near the front of the line. Owning the present turned into a head start on owning the future. For the average person, the payoff is genuinely exciting. Silicon in the anode means your next phone can be thinner and still last longer. Your next electric car could go further on a smaller, lighter pack. Charging times keep shrinking toward the point where topping up a car feels closer to filling a tank of gas than plugging in overnight. These are not distant promises anymore. They are already trickling into products you can buy today. The 30-year reign of the pure graphite anode is ending in real time, inside the devices in your hand and the cars in your driveway, whether you noticed it happening or not. So step back and look at the whole board. A soft gray mineral that almost nobody thinks about turned out to be one of the most strategically important materials of the century. China saw that before anyone else and spent 20 years quietly locking it down. Then, at the exact moment, its graphite dominance looked unbeatable. It started funding and shipping the very technology that will eventually shrink graphite's role. Not out of confusion, out of confidence. When you control the transition, you don't fear the future. You sell it, one battery at a time. Step back, and the irony is almost poetic. For years, the Western strategy against China's graphite monopoly boiled down to a single quiet hope. Wait for the technology to change. Bet that some breakthrough would make China's mountain of graphite factories irrelevant overnight. That breakthrough came. Silicon is real, it works, and it is shipping right now. And the main thing it proved is that China had already climbed the next mountain before anyone else finished arguing about the map. The old assumption was that new technology naturally breaks old monopolies, that the next big thing always creates an opening for a fresh new winner to charge in and topple the giant. This story suggests something a lot less comforting. Sometimes the company that dominates the old world is also the best positioned to dominate the new one, because the skills, the factories, and the supply chains carry straight over. The name on the battery might change from graphite to silicon, but the flag stamped on the side of the factory might stay exactly the same. It is worth sitting with how quietly all of this happened. There was no single dramatic announcement, no clean moment where the world visibly changed. Just 20 years of steady, patient, unglamorous industrial work, followed by a pivot so smooth that most people never noticed the ground shifting beneath them. While headlines argued about tariffs and trade wars, the actual game was being decided in furnaces and processing plants and quarterly shipment reports that almost nobody bothers to read. That is often how real power works. Not with a bang, but with a supply chain. Graphite ruled the battery for 30 years. Its replacement is finally here, born from silicon and clever carbon cages, and a problem that took decades of patient work to solve. The strange twist is who is holding the knife. Not a scrappy Western challenger racing to bring down the giant itself, calmly building the weapon that ends its own product, because it already owns whatever comes next. That is not the end of China's grip on the battery. It might just be the quiet beginning of a much tighter one. And the rest of the world is only now starting to realize the game was never really about graphite at all. It was never a question of whether graphite would fall, but of who would be standing on that mountain it left behind.